Shall we begin? Tress of the Emerald Sea. No preamble, let's get right into it. Tress of the Emerald Sea is the latest book by America's premier fantasy author and my personal favorite, Brandon Sanderson. Because he's the GOAT!
That's why he's the GOAT! The GOAT!
It's the first in a set number of books coming up as part of his 2022 Kickstarter. And it takes us into the wider book universe of the Cosmere, which is the magical universe of planets in which most of Sanderson's books take place. It's not one of the primary planets, and it's not tied into one of the greater stories inside the Cosmere, but it does give us a little bit more backstory on a recently demonstrated magic system that we haven't gotten a good look at so far. So, the story centers around the titular character, Tress. Tress lives on an island, a resource island, in the middle of the Emerald Sea that's apparently so terrible that the people who live there aren't allowed to leave. It's so terrible that the people who run the island, the Duke who runs the island, and the king above him believe that if they were allowed to leave, they would go. So these people have to live, die, and procreate on this island without any of them ever leaving, or so the rules say. Now, Tress lives and works as a window washer on this island. She doesn't do any of the resource gathering. She's not a sailor. She doesn't do anything like that. She washes windows and she makes pies. And doing this, she makes money for her parents who are too ill and old to work, and for her younger brother. And she does this all by herself, taking care of her family. She's an awkward child, doesn't really have a whole lot of friends. She's not particularly popular. The only person that she really gets along with besides her family is the Duke's son, Charlie. Charlie!
Charlie.
Tress, one of her quirks is that she collects cups, and she comes to Charlie and shows off any cups that she finds, and talks about how interesting she finds them and the interesting places from which said cups come from. Isn't that cute?
Isn't that cute? But it's wrong!
Now, Charlie and Tress start getting a little too close, and the Duke, not a big fan of that because Tress is a commoner. So when he realizes that Tress and Charlie are getting a little too close, he decides to take his son away and marry him off to some noble girl somewhere else. Charlie, clearly, is in love with Tress and doesn't want to do that. So he promises not to marry any of them, to be terrible, and come back to her. And it turns out Charlie's a man of his word. He behaves terribly with each of these women who he's carded before by his father, and just behaves abhorrently, and apparently throws up on one of them. Lovely gentleman, that Charlie, for the most part. So the Duke and the King get sick of Charlie's antics. So when he's abducted by the sorceress of the Midnight Sea, and she demands a ransom for him, the King and the Duke say, "No, we're not going to pay that." And so the Duke goes back to the island, and he brings his nephew and his nephew's wife, and says that his nephew's going to be his heir now, and to hell with Charlie. This, of course, does not sit well with Tress, who's been waiting for Charlie to come back. All she has of him are the cups that he sent back to her during his travels to find a wife that he's not going to marry. So all she has left of him are these cups, and she decides, well, I'm not going to let it in here. It can't end like this. She decides to leave the island and rescue Charlie. Now that's what I'm talking about. Stand by your man.
Stand by your man.
That's the kind of woman you want. It's basically a damsel in distress story, except the damsel here is Charlie, not Tress. Good God, my camera sucks. Now, after escaping her island, Tress finds herself the deckhand on a pirate ship called the Crow Song, captained by the infamous Captain Crow.
That's got to be the best pirate I've ever seen.
So it would seem.
lovely woman who just happens to be a spore eater. Now, this is a person who has spores inside their body. They're protected by those spores, and those spores are slowly eating away at them from the inside. So Crow's whole deal is she's trying to find a way to save her life before the spores in her body devour her. And she's willing to do whatever it takes to do that. Because she doesn't want to end up looking like this. Unfortunately for Tress, whatever it takes just happens to mean trading her to a dragon. Now, fortunately for Tress, she's not alone on the Crow's song. She brings along Huck. Huck is a talking rat. Now, on her way to the Crow's song, she just happened to meet this rat who can talk. And according to him, he's from an island with other talking rats. And it just happens to be a thing that exists in this world, talking rats. Which is fine by Tress. Huck is very helpful. He does some things. He spies for Tress. He's moral support. He's there for Tress the whole time. And constantly trying to advise her against some of the more dangerous aspects of her journey. Tress is the homeboy.
My man.
Now, personally, I don't care about spoilers, but I'm also not going to go down the list of crew members of the Crow song, the other characters who are important to the story, because I feel even if I know what's going to happen, I get enjoyment out of enjoying the story and the characters doing what they do, interacting with the world at large, and letting the events pan out as they will. Even if I know what's going to happen, it's the seeing and or reading of that entertains me. So, moving on, we're going to talk about the dragon that Crow tries to trade Tress to. Now, the dragon wants servants, basically. Servants who aren't afraid of spores. Now, I mentioned before how spores would instantly sprout if they're exposed to water or any other type of liquid. What I didn't mention is that means if a spore just happens to come into contact with your body, if it falls into your mouth or into your eye or comes in contact with your blood in any sort of way, that's the end of you. That spore is sprouting, and depending on what kind of spore can determine just how violent that death is. If it's a ruby spore, you're getting impaled. If it's an emerald spore, you're being eviscerated by vines from the inside. If it's a sapphire spore, the blue ones, it's an explosion. An air explosion, but an explosion nonetheless. Those are the spores they use to fire cannonballs. So yeah, not a pleasant situation. So the only people that the dragon can have as servants are people who aren't afraid of spores, because spores are a whole big part of his domain.
Hey! I'm not afraid anymore! I said I'm not afraid anymore!
So Crow thinks, hey, I got this girl on my ship who I originally saw as a deckhand, who has slowly over time become a sprouter. She's not afraid of spores enough that I can trade her to the dragon to cure my spore eater disease and continue living. What she fails to realize is that Tress can use that against her. By dint of her being a spore eater, she isn't particularly afraid of spores either. So instead, Tress manages to trade her to the dragon instead of herself. And then Tress becomes the new captain of the Crow song, because all the other characters have come to love her and admire her and her abilities. Plus, they kind of thought she was like a secret agent for the king. That's a whole big thing. That's not super important, but it explains part of the reason why she was able to garner the admiration and love of the crew. That, and she saved their life a couple times. And that's big brownie points for saving the life of the entire crew. They like it when you do that. So, given that they all admire Tress so much now, she's able to convince them to take her to the Midnight Sea. Now, the midnight spores are less immediately dangerous than the other spore types. They're slightly different in the sense that when they sprout into midnight essence, which can take a physical form and be controlled by the person who sprouts it in exchange for the water in their body. So that whole sea is protected by the midnight essence warriors created by the sorceress. So if they can't find a way through the Midnight Sea to get to the sorceress, then they're just going to be destroyed by her Midnight Essence creations. Tress, being the lovely person that she is, and not wanting the crew to die for her rescuing Charlie, decides to make herself go into the Midnight Sea by herself. That's right, she's going it alone!
I'm living alone!
Now, although this is the spoiler section of the review, there is a pretty big twist here that I didn't even see coming. The reason why I'm willing to spoil the things that I've spoiled already is because they're pretty apparent to any like long-time fantasy reader or consumer of media. Like, you can see a lot of this stuff coming. This twist I didn't see coming, so I'm not going to spoil it here. What I will mention is the narrator. Now, there's a reoccurring character that spans most of the Cosmere books written by Sanderson, and that character's name is Hoyd, and he just happens to be the narrator of this book. Now, the audiobook narrator, Michael Kramer, is one of my favorite audiobook narrators, is the like narrator, but for the sake of the story, it's being explained to us by the in-universe character of Hoyd, who is under a curse from the sorceress. Now, if he can manage to get to the sorceress, his curse will be lifted. And this is essentially what ends the story. Hoyd makes it to the sorceress, his curse is lifted, and they're able to get not only defeat the sorceress, but get the sorceress to just kind of be removed from the situation altogether. I won't spoil the very lovely things that just happened to pan out in that situation. But by the end of it, Tress manages to get back home to the island as the new captain of a brand new ship. All the crew members of the Crow Song join her along on this, and Charlie decides to become her valet. And it's such a touching moment. So, in conclusion, you should absolutely read Tress and the Emerald Sea on Spotify. Give our man Brandon some money. He's earned it. And my next review will probably be The Lost Metal, the final book of the Era 2 of Mistborn, and the book where we got our first introduction into spores and the essences. I've been reading the Mistborn books for years, and I'm very happy to see this epic conclusion to Era 2. So, look forward to that. I highly recommend.